Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue sur Wandering DMs. Je m'appelle Paul.
Hey, je m'appelle Dan. And on this episode of Wandering DMs, because that's pretty much all the French I know, on this episode of Wandering DMs, we're going to be talking about languages in D&D and other fantasy games, and we're going to be talking about where they come from, where are they going, and which one is the best to learn. All that and more today on Wandering DMs.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. I am, in fact, wandering today, as you can tell by the lovely Airbnb behind me. As usual, would love to show you the glorious view out my window, but cameras don't work that way. I am in the lovely Ile-de-Perrot, just outside of Montreal, where there's a predominantly French-speaking area. All the street signs are in French. People are greeting me in French. It's a different experience.
Cool. I think that's the thing that motivated us this week to talk about languages in D&D. And so I was doing a little bit of research last night and this morning, and I came to the realization that linguistics is a very large subject. Did you know? Were you aware of this, Paul? Because I'm a little bit disturbed to realize that we bit off a 1-hour episode about like all of linguistics, both real and fictional. So,
we can maybe focus in just on what it's what it's like to play a role playing game where the characters maybe understand different languages than each other or the other members in their world. I was very curious, frankly, to come up to this area. It's like actually my first time traveling in a place that is not a native English-speaking area, and my French is not the best. It's definitely drawing on high school lessons, quite dated. But the interesting thing about Montreal is that it's kind of a bilingual place, right? In fact, I think they say that they're actually speaking Quebecois, which is kind of a weird mashup, or more that they very frequently flip between French and English. I was at a cafe yesterday where on the menu was both chocolat chaud, which is hot chocolate, as well as cold brew.
Interesting. Yeah.
Both on the menu just like that. I was like, okay. It's actually kind of nice for someone who doesn't understand French very well, because I can just kind of fall back into English when I feel like, and nobody bats an eye.
Right. Well, admittedly, when I've traveled in France in the past, and I'm not a huge traveler, but I have gone there at least once, I more or less just had to act like I was dumb because I'm traveling with someone who's a native French speaker, and so the awkward thing is that she would be speaking, and then everybody would just assume that I was also a native French speaker, and they'd turn to me and ask a question or say something, and I'd be like, pardon moi, I don't know. Just assume that I'm stupid, I guess. And a couple of people in the chat are pointing out that, and it's true. We call I initially grew up in Maine. It's right next to Canada. Had a lot of French Canadian people in the community around me. It was very common. A lot of French Canadian names and things like that. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I learned that native French speakers consider Canadian French, consider Quebecois to be a fairly different language and might not actually be able to understand it, as a matter of fact. Which was an interesting realization. So even though we call both of them French, you might actually have trouble communicating between continental French and Canadian French, actually, is what I've learned. And a couple of people already knew that before I said that in the chat there. So that was an interesting realization. One thing I'll point out is that when I was growing up in Maine, we actually used French currency and coins interchangeably with American. So I grew up having a pocket full of American and Canadian pennies and nickels and dimes, and just at a store, no difference. And it wasn't until I moved to Boston and did that same thing, and some storekeeper got really angry at me. It was like, what are you doing? What kind of scam are you trying to pull here? And I was like, oh, that's not normally a thing. I just thought that Canadian American coinage was interchangeable. Sorry.
Wow. Yeah, definitely not with the exchange rate.
Yeah. Right.
Fascinating. I'm finding up here, one of the interesting things that's hit me is, once or twice someone's come up and just spoken very rapid French to me, and I have to say, I'm sorry, I don't understand you. Je ne comprends. Anyway, I'm sure I just said that wrong. But the interesting thing is I've noticed that, like, oftentimes it's just a matter of which greeting do you use. If I say bonjour, then we're speaking French. And if I say hello, then we're speaking English. And that seems to be enough. Which is fascinating, I think, because of course, I knew we were going to have this discussion today, and so I keep relating it back to D&D. So one of the things that jumps out to me about D&D is the existence of common, right, as a language. It's common. Everyone speaks it. Like, it doesn't even get a name of a region or a culture. It's just common, which is kind of like English, right? But not really. But it's kind of like, right? Like you were saying that you kind of only need to know how to say, do you speak English these days? And that's enough to hit things off.
You get around lots of the parts of the world, actually.
Yeah.
And of course, our mutual joke is, of course, that English is the lingua franca of the modern day to a large degree.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. It's.
I will say, I've been. It's funny. The name of, the common tongue in original D&D. I noticed that they've got it like in scare quotes. They've got the common tongue, which would make me think that you should be replacing that with some other name in your campaign world, I guess. But on the other hand, I guess that actually does get used in Lord of the Rings, I guess. I guess they call Westron, which is the English analog that hobbits and men use. I guess occasionally they do call that the common speech in the text. So I guess that's where that came from. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
But I would presume the assumption there is that it's the common speech of this area that we are in right now, right? Like there's an implicit still behind that. That's what always struck me as weird about common as it's presented in D&D, is that it seems to be acultural. And you're like, what is this language that's everyone knows? Literally everyone knows, right? Like every character you ever make definitely knows common, which is fascinating, right? Except for that one game we played at my birthday where everybody spoke only Elvish.
I feel that there's a tension, right? I feel that there's a tension in that language is, clearly connected to culture. I think if I, and I'm not the biggest expert in this, but I think that language is clearly connected to culture, and you have this tension of you want something in your core rules, but you're trying to keep it separate from the campaign setting. And there's a little bit of a tension about exactly how do you arrange that. Let me say this. Okay, let me just take a little bit of a tangent. But my opening thesis for today is this, right? Arguably, you could argue that our entire fantasy gaming hobby is really a derivative of an interest in linguistics, right? So Tolkien, who is, I think we all agree, not the only, but the largest influence on D&D. That's where all the monsters come from in chainmail and things like that. Tolkien himself said that largely he wrote Lord of the Rings as a wrapper around his lifelong passion for linguistics and making up fantasy languages for elves and dwarves and men and hobbits and orcs, right? His fundamental burning desire was to explore the construction of fantasy languages. And Lord of the Rings was just sort of like, here's how I'm going to embed this so that people encounter it. I need it. Language comes from history, comes from culture. So I need a history, and this history is going to be Lord of the Rings. So, arguably we could say that, an interest in languages came first, and our entire fantasy hobby has really downriver from that. So languages are incredibly important. They're hugely important to our game. And I'm glad that we're getting an opportunity to talk about it today. So, Tolkien himself created like dozens of languages, right, over the years.
Yeah.
And his primary focus was in Elvish. So to my understanding, he constructed at least 15 different languages just for Elvish alone, right, including Kenya and Sindarin and a whole bunch of other ones. And then you get little smatterings in Lord of the Rings you get a little smattering of what ought to be Dwarvish. You get a little smattering of what ought to be Orcish, things like that. And, and then you have the black speech that Sauron invented for his underlings and stuff like that. And I'll point out, you've got a Dwarvish language, you've got an Orcish language, and, starting with Tolkien, this, we are equating species to race to ethnicity to culture to language are kind of one thing. So of course we've always in D&D talked about the Dwarven language and the Orcish language and the Goblin language, and that all flows out of Tolkien. We basically still have that in D&D today, and I can certainly imagine someone critiquing that nowadays as, I'd say for simplicity, equating all of these separate factors. But that's one thing to think about, is that for most things in D&D, race dictates your language.
Interesting. And part of this, one of the things we wanted to talk about here, or one of the things I wanted to talk about here is, last week we were talking about the new edition of D&D that's coming out. And it's one of the things that jumped out at me in that opening bit of rules that they released is the languages. That in the new edition, by default, you create a new character will be trilingual. They will have common, they will have a language based on race, and they will have a language based on background. Mm-hmm. Which is not actually. At first, I was like, "That's a lot of language. Everyone's trilingual. That's a lot." But if you think about it, in old school D&D, right? You definitely knew common. You possibly knew a racial language, and you also had an alignment language, right? So,
correct.
Right. So it's kind of maybe not different. And the reason I'm saying all this is to circle back to that alignment language, which is fascinating. I think that's something you and I have talked about, and we've been grumpy about in the past. I think about alignment languages, but you mentioned Tolkien having a dark speech, and surely that must be the origin of this concept that there are alignment languages, right?
To me, it seems clearly connected. Like, frankly, the Tolkien's black speech of Sauron seems like the best model for how that makes sense at all. Frankly, so if you're going to defend alignment languages at all from classic D&D, you do point to black speech as possibly the most coherent expression of it. I will point out that there's a work of Tolkien. There's an early work of Tolkien called the Lammas, which outlines his overview for all the languages together in Middle Earth. And his overall structure is that language come from the gods, from the Vanir initially, in 3 branches. Get them 3 branches. There's Oromian, where you get all the Elven and Men's languages. You get Olian, which is basically the Dwarves' language, and you get Melkian, which is the Orcish speech. 3 languages. And of 3 branches, right? 3 branches of families of languages. And it's kind of interesting that original D&D has 3 alignments and therefore 3 alignment languages. So I feel like I could kind of point to these families of branches in Tolkien's Lammas as possibly analogous. Do we like alignment languages? Do we generally like alignment languages?
Personally, I've never been fond of them because they get too close to that same issue of what is the culture? Why do I know these languages? How was I taught these languages growing up? It seems weird, and it's too blanket, I guess. Right? There's especially when you only have 3 alignments. Holy cow! There's a lot of things that speak all this same language. No, excellent, good comment.
I think Hobo Owner is summarizing some of the chat comments right now. Concisely, and we appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, let me jump back here. Honestly, one of the problems I have with language is there's, as you pointed out, the origin of language in role-playing games is very academic. But I think there's something really fascinating about the cultural, the day-to-day, the bumping into a shopkeeper and trying to just talk, that we're going to end up role-playing, that I want to see portrayed. Like, what is it like to not know the language of the people around you? Or what is it like to speak the language that's not the common language? Or, there I am using common again. But, that is not the typical language of the culture that you're in currently. right? Like I kept waiting for, and I've seen this once or twice around here. Usually, most of the people I've interacted with very comfortable in either French or English. They have no problem just jumping back and forth between them. And so the moment I ask for English, no big deal, and we're immediately speaking English. But once or twice, I've encountered a person who kind of gives a little, like, a little sigh, a little, oh, I have to try to do this in English, huh? Right? I had a guard at a museum the other day. The way wasn't well marked. Let me say that. The way wasn't well marked, and I had wandered into an area I wasn't supposed to be in. And the guard came up and said a bunch of French to me, which was too fast. I didn't understand. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't understand you in English. Which he then kind of, had a little sigh and then just looked at me and said, it's forbidden. And I was like, okay. Like you clearly don't have a lot of English. But it's forbidden. Okay. Right. And then he kind of hand gestured to me where I'm supposed to go. And I kind of went that way and it was fine. Right. Yeah. But, I feel like we don't get those moments in role-playing games. We don't think to role-play those moments of, you're in the elven town and you speak common and have the elves like roll their eyes and go, oh, common. Okay. I guess I'll talk to you in common, right? Or something like that.
That's a good moment. And I mean, like one of my questions mechanically, right, is that it has been true in D&D all along that language acquisition is binary, right? You either have it or you don't. And we all know that's not how language works in the real world. Of course not.
Yeah.
People are more proficient or less proficient. There are ways of measuring that. Now, there are other games. And for example, the first one I think I ever encountered was the TSR game Top Secret that would give you a numerical measurement. I think in Top Secret was a percentage of like what percentage of the language, I don't know, it's just a percentage, whatever it is, right? And I think, is that how they do it in Call of Cthulhu? I think that you have like a skill in like Call of Cthulhu that you can be better or worse at a language, I think.
Yeah. I don't think they ever tell you what's that supposed to mean.
Right.
Although, in more modern roleplay, I've made little tricks like saying, if someone's poor at a language, I like saying something like either you can only say words that are 1 or 2 syllables at most. Another one that just dawned on me, which I haven't tried yet, but I would love to do, is you can only speak in the present tense. Right?
Yeah.
I'm sure that's right. The funny thing about that is it sounds funny and it sounds enjoyable, but it's hard. That's what I came up with, is that, forcing people to really think about what they're saying in the moment. Be like, I can't say it that way. Which maybe is a nice, method role play there.
So I have an anecdote, right? So I used to go on canoe trips more than I currently do. So the month before I entered the University of Maine, they had an optional entry canoe trip, and only like a dozen people, I don't know, like a dozen or 15 people signed up for it, not many people. But we would go out and we were in the wilderness of Maine on a canoe trip for a whole week, right? Mm-hmm. And it was sort of a team build, there were team building exercises and get to know people and that kind of thing. So one night they sat us down. I don't know, this might not be legal now that this comes out of my mouth. They sat us down at a picnic table, right? And we're going to fix dinner, right? We're gonna prepare dinner, right? So they tie us together with rope, so we can't.
Well, it sounds like a D&D campaign already. Okay,
right? Exactly, right. They tie us together with a rope. We only have candles for lighting, and we're gonna mutually prepare dinner. And they go around the 12 people, and they alternately go, "You cannot talk at all. You talk only in 1-syllable words. You can't talk. You talk in 1 syllables. You can't talk. You talk in 1 syllables. You can't talk." Now I'm at the end of the line, and and as a smart ass, I say, "Let me guess. I can only talk in 4-syllable words." And they go, "Well, now, yes." Right. I'm doing all these. So everybody else is like stumbling with what you exactly just said about trying to explain what they want in 1 syllable, and I'm coming up with like all these elaborate illuminatory, constructivist-ish vocabularyisms in order to try to get myself understood.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So you're right. There were that dinner was like, not French cuisine. I'll say that. We got fed.
That's hilarious. That is hilarious.
I think
I don't know.
For some reason, I remember laughing so hard when someone turned to someone and say, "I need more wax lights," because they couldn't say candles, right? And it came out so totally smooth, just like, "Hey, I need more wax lights." Like that's just how we always talk. Right.
Yeah. Oh God, that's funny. So I guess let me take a step back. Then, where is the fun? Why is it interesting to have multiple languages in D&D? Why not just say screw it? There's only one language everyone speaks it. We're done.
Okay, so for me, the best, and again, this came up by surprise, not too long ago, but for me, the really wonderful play that I got was, a year or two ago, was forcing certain players to do the negotiation that don't normally do that role playing. So I've had cases where, there's usually someone who's personality wise kind of head of the pack a little bit, or they have a high charisma score. And so every time you run into an NPC or a monster or something like that, that particular player wants to get pushed up in front and run the smooth negotiations. And then you run into a situation where they don't have the language to do it. And you have some other player who's been taking kind of second seat on those things, doesn't do a lot of role playing, and they just happen to have that language on their sheet. And even though kind of nobody wants it and everybody's uncomfortable with it, that player all of a sudden has to run the negotiation because they're the only one that can talk. Right. And that was like a really fresh piece of business that kind of pushes someone normally in a back seat up front. And I had a really, and now that person is now the leader of the bugbears in the dungeon, right? They're the person that everybody recognizes as they tell the bugbears what to do. And I thought that was like a really enjoyable piece of business to have the resources of the languages kind of split up among different members of the party.
That is nice. That is a good effect, I would say. I assume that's happening because the bugbears are getting charmed.
In that case, actually, no. Surrendered in a fight. Actually,
surrendered. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Roll a morale check. Threw down their weapons. Right. Surrendered. What do we do now?
Yeah.
Yep. Could have been a charm spell.
I feel like there's many times where I feel like the language barrier forces action, right? And I don't know, you can tell me whether this is good or bad, but cases where the party comes up, they see a bunch of posturing, angry goblins who shout words at them that they don't understand. And the players go, well, we don't understand them. So,
and those words, of course, are Briark.
Briark. Right, but it kind of forces the hand, right? Like, they're posturing, they look violent, they look unhappy. I can't communicate with them, I can't negotiate. I guess we're going to fight, right? Which is unfortunate, I think, sometimes, right? There's cases where it's like, well, maybe it would be a fun situation to roleplay if only you knew the language. And then there's other times where it's, I don't know, maybe it's enjoyable. Of like, nope, gosh, it sure would have been nice if we could have communicated with them, but just because of the way our party is built, we don't have that skill.
And look, I'll admit that like original D&D comes out of war game, so the intention initially is there are fights, and the original D&D rules do say in the text monsters by default just attack. The end, unless the DM writes something else in the text, or they're intelligent and can see that they're overwhelmed. All the monsters just attack. That's the game. So certainly at the root, it wasn't built in that you're going to go through the entire dungeon negotiating your way.
See, I always enjoyed, though, and I guess my head always goes into out of the dungeon, back to town, right? Especially when the players are traveling or they're hex crawling somewhere, and they end up in a town that is different culturally than the one that they came from. Whether that's because, I mean, usually for me ends up being tied to race, right? Like you're in the woods, you discover a camp of wood elves. They only speak Elf, right?
That's a good point.
Like I feel like that's usually where it comes up for me. And that you could still have the same effect of pushing a different player to the forefront. I also, in cases where we get uncomfortable, where we're forced to do a little bit of game of telephone at the table, right? If the elf leader wants to talk to Dan, but in order to talk to Dan, he's got to go through Paul. And so the GM is telling me, and I'm having to turn and just reflect the same information to you. I find that amusing, usually because like it just happens naturally, right? Like just like the very game of telephone is exactly that, right? Like I will somehow, just through my own foolish memory, mangle the communication. But since we all actually heard the actual words, the rest of the table gets a laugh at it, right? Because like, haha, that's not really. We all know that's not what the chief of the elves said. You screwed it up. I'm like, yeah, well, I said what I said.
Totally. We've had a good time with those kinds of situations, actually. Yeah. I mean, another thing I'll throw out that we've had a good time playing with is like handouts, right? Here's a handout or a script or something like that that's a physical piece of business, but it's in a different language. And how can you translate it? How can you translate it? Who can you translate it? And like a thing that like became a whole part of our major campaign that we used to run together in the 3rd edition era is I had my partner Isabel, who is a French native originally, playing a half-orc fighter. And so I started developing these, handouts that are supposed to be in Orcish. And so in order to represent that, I would use Google Translate and I would translate it into French. So, and then put it in some kind of like, Orcish type script. So French became Orcish in that particular game. Nobody else at the table knew Orcish, and nobody else, no character at the table knew Orcish, and no player at the table knew French, other than Isabel. So French became Orcish, and then that kind of snowballed. And in that particular campaign, French culture became Orcish culture. So they had elaborate dishes and a lot of cream sauces and right and on and on. And that I had this whole Orcish kingdom that was basically this weird mangling of French culture on the table, but basically just spawned out of that little language thing. Now,
that's
that kind of right. I love that so much. And the funny thing is, Google Translate didn't do that great a job. So Isabel would get it and she would have trouble reading it like it was archaic or something like that. This isn't a very good translation. And I'm like, good. That's, it got garbled along the way someplace. So we had a lot of fun with that. And so you can consider, there's, those kinds of tools are really excellent. Google Translate now has, 100, 200 different languages, some of which I've never heard of before. So one option is you could say in your campaign, you could pick some, language that you don't otherwise know, establish that as this particular language in your campaign, and use Google Translate to get all your handouts printed out. And then maybe if you have some player that knows one language and the other don't, you could tie that in. That's not something you could universalize because that was very much a one single place and one single time for us with the particular mix of players that we had. But boy, that added a lot to that particular campaign. It completely kind of changed it in some ways.
I mean, you could certainly play with technology there as a way of just, all right, because this is here's a handout. It's written in French. Because your character is an orc, you're allowed to get out your phone and use Google Translate to translate it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Good point.
Do that.
Good point. Yeah.
You could do that. Maybe that's enjoyable. I mean, I do love the adaptation of real world cultures into fantasy cultures. I think that's hilarious. That's of course we're all now, or at least me, I'm immediately imagining orcs in berets who smoke a lot. Because that's just how orcs are. Yeah. That is excellent. See
an orc wagon, right? Your next orc caravan has wagons completely stuffed with baguettes.
Delightful, delightful.
I gotta get these before they go stale.
Yeah. Okay, let me bring a couple of things, a couple of real world things that we see happening when people don't know languages that come up in that could come up in roleplay. We don't often see them come up in roleplay, but I think it would be fun. Somebody I think posted. I saw it go by, and I'm already missing it. But like, you could have. Shoot, I'm not finding it, Dan. Maybe you're better at scouring the chat. But somebody mentioned like that's when you don't speak the native language, all the prices double. Right? Like you could have your shopkeepers give different prices whether you speak the language or not, because they assume you are, not local. There you go. If you don't speak the town's language, you get the special menus.
By Jerry McDonald made that point. Yeah.
Yeah. That's good. I mean, I've seen stuff. There's a trope I think that goes around social media of people, stories of they were surprised to know that I spoke the local language. Right? You could, as DM, have players walk into Elf Town, and the chief of the elves and his second in command start talking in Elvish with the assumption the players don't understand it because none of the players are elves. And you say they just start talking in Elvish. Doesn't know it, right? And maybe one of the characters does, and you go, great, okay, so here's what they're saying, and just role play out the NPCs talking to each other with the assumption that they believe the players can't understand them.
Great.
That could be fun.
I've been with Isabel like on the train here in New York when that's happened to her, of people nearby, and she's like, that's really rude. Why are they?
Right.
That kind of thing. Yeah, that's a good piece.
Definitely
of business.
a lot of people take comfort in believing that their conversation is private when maybe it's not.
Exactly. There's a lot of people in New York learning a lot of different languages around us all the time. Totally.
Yeah.
Now maybe we should talk mechanics a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Go. No. We can jump to mechanics. Go for it.
Okay, so two things, right? So two primary things on my mind that kind of interact with like D&D rules, and I'm going to assume that we've got the binary rule. Okay, so I don't think D&D has never stepped towards the percentage base. I'm thinking about Top Secret in the Top Secret adventures in the 80s from TSR, which is espionage type stuff. They had to have this page size table for all the NPCs, because every NPC got rated in every different language, in English, French, German, and Russian, with a percentage number for every single NPC in the entire adventure. Right? Yeah. And I'm like, how am I going to remember or use this? I never managed to actually make that become effective in the game, whether someone's got 75% in Russian and 52% in French. I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. So
I especially like the granularity there. The granularity of 52% versus 50%. Like,
absolutely.
52%. The conjugation of 3 more verbs, right?
Right. So D&D's always had, binary languages, and it's kind of funny because in 3rd edition, speaking a new language was wrapped into the skill subsystem, and every other skill would have points, right? You've got 5 points in climb, and you've got 6 points in use magic item or something like that. But then speak language specifically says speak language does not work like any other skill. You either have it or you don't, and there's no points for it. Every other skill is different than this, right? What? So why did you put it in that subsystem in the first place? And that's been treated differently afterwards, but that was what 3rd edition was like. So let's just assume that we've got binary languages for simplicity, which is what I've always played with. Okay. The two primary questions that I have that seem to interact are, how many languages do you know, and how many languages are in the world, right? So you were remarking on the 6th edition draft we were looking at next week, with everybody's going to be starting with 3 languages. Well, in original D&D, you could have characters that start with like 10, hypothetically, because you'd start with common, you get your alignment language, and then you'd get 1 more language per point of intelligence over 10. So if you are starting off with 18 in intelligence, that's 8 extra bonus languages.
That's a lot.
That's so people in classic D&D by the book would have a crap ton of languages, and if you are a dwarf, I think the rules say common and dwarvish and goblin and hobgoblin and orcish or something like that. And if you're an elf, likewise, you start off with at least 5 languages, if not more.
I mean, that's
but they also have more languages.
My recollection from BX is that was actually one of the advantages to bringing an elf, or maybe a dwarf, but probably an elf with you, is it just opened the door. Like, anybody playing an elf immediately had a ton more languages than everyone else. They just got them for free.
Yep, totally. That's absolutely what was in the book. And, I remember stumbling over that as a very young DM. I remember, going into a dungeon and the players confront some goblins, and I'm trying to make it mysterious, right? They're small creatures and they have large teeth and they look like this, and you don't know what they are. And one of my players goes, I speak goblin, so I feel like I should be able to know what a goblin is if I run into them. And I'm like, that's a good point. That's a good point that I overlooked. These are goblins.
Yeah.
So there were a lot. You had to take up quite a large amount of space on your character sheet to list all these different, racial languages that you probably started off with. But on the other hand, there was a much larger, every single monster race in the game all had their own language. So they had a much larger list of languages than you do nowadays with basically since 3rd edition, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th have a much smaller list of languages. So I'm kind of wondering where to turn the dials on that. Know a bunch of stuff, have a bunch of stuff in the world. Should it be smaller for simplicity? And I don't know if you want to look at the tables of languages that we've got queued up.
Sure, we can do that. Is this one of them?
This is 1st edition, right? So this is out of the 1st edition advanced D&D Dungeon Master's Guide is where they put this stuff. And you can see here's a table for random language determination for like NPCs or maybe a magic sword or something like that. And every prominent, monster type has any kind of intelligence basically has their own language, including, right, subtypes of dragon. Right? Black dragon's a different language than blue dragon, is different than red dragon. Subtypes of giant, right? Cloud giant, frost giant, fire giant all have different languages, even Nagas. And then right at the end, Zorn have their own language. Sylphs have a language that's different than pixies. Ogre is different than ogre mage. And then at the end, you have a 15% chance right at the end of human, foreign, or other, right? Which includes choose an unlisted creature language. So this goes on and on even more than this.
Yeah. I'm always surprised by what I consider kind of solitary monsters, right? Like the Zorn. Right? The idea that Zorn have their own language does not imply that there's a Zorn society somewhere. There's a Zorn culture, that the Zorn congregate in some way and talk to each other. It's not a thing I had ever really imagined Zorn doing.
I think that's an ad, right? I kind of feel like that's an ad as it starts to make me think about other stuff I could add to my campaign to answer that. Yeah, I'll say yeah. Why not? Why not say yes to that?
Yeah, on the flip side, apparently dragons are very segregated by color. That blue dragons and red dragons don't really understand each other at all. It's fascinating.
Right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. And then you can contrast this. And at some point, I think I might have it on my blog, actually. Like, I took that asterisk note for all the other stuff and made a comprehensive search through 1st edition for every monster that had enough intelligence to have language, and have like a 1 through 100 table for all the other monsters in case you land on that particular one. So that was, again, we're connoting, species to race, to ethnicity, to culture, to language. I'm certainly not the person to disentangle all that stuff. But for a role-playing game that initially was just like a hobby, it's, you can kind of see why that was a simple way of getting it out there.
Yeah. It also, I was going to say, it also, the problem becomes compounding, right? Much like, I don't know, spells, right? That the more content that gets produced, the more languages exist, right? Every new module that includes a new monster type adds a new language to the game, and it makes it has a weird impact on the world building, right?
That's a good point.
We live in this world that has hundreds of languages, which maybe is not terribly off the mark for the real world, but
yeah, right. Admittedly, the real world does have hundreds of languages.
Yeah.
So in some sense, that kind of hits me the right way. Actually, there's however many there's dozens more that are going to surprise you someday. I actually kind of don't mind that myself. But again, I might be biased. This is what I grew up with, so I might be biased.
Yeah. But what you don't have, where it breaks down in corollary to the real world, right, is what you don't have is huge expanses of distance between the groups who are speaking different languages, right? Like, most likely you're going to encounter all these creatures in a dungeon or within a short distance of your homeland, right? That I go into a dungeon and I encounter 6 different monster types, all of which are speaking a different language, all within this one underground complex. That seems unusual, shall we say? That's
to my understanding. Again, I'm not a linguist. To my understanding, there are places in the world, right? There are places in the world that have variant dialects pretty close to each other, a couple towns over, a couple miles away, I think. So if these monsters have come from other enclaves and they've taken up parts of your dungeon, I think I could defend that. I'm not going to say that's what would exactly happen. I think I could defend that.
You end up with the argument of, okay, well, then these languages are somewhat related, so like orcs and goblins should be able to kind of communicate because they're in the same language family. And now, are we right back to alignment languages? So we just circled back to that.
For what it's worth, in original D&D, the rule is like every racial type has their own language, and 20% of them know common.
Yeah.
So that's, so you get a smattering. You get a smattering of here's the words we need to communicate when we need to communicate. I really do want to get more back into alignment languages, but maybe let's just look at the 5th edition list of languages just to contrast that large list.
Sure.
Or 3rd or 6th, because they're mostly the same.
Great. I'm going to pick one at random. I'm hoping I'm showing the right image here. Is that the
5th
edition
is
list?
The 6th edition. So that's what's in the draft for 1D&D.
Okay.
It's going to follow up 5th. And it mostly looks that list. So this is 3rd.
Darn it.
And is that 3rd? No, that's I think that's 3rd. Is that 5th? That might be 5th. I can't tell the difference. They're so close. God.
What's this one, Dan? Identify this list of languages.
That's 3rd. Okay, that I know this. That's 3rd, and the one we were just looking at before is 5th. That's it. So this is 3rd. So the point here, and they're pretty darn similar since 3rd is this is all the languages, right? This is all of them.
Right.
So it's greatly collapsed. There's only about 20 or so, and you've got the giant language, and that's for all the different giant types plus ogres, right? You've got the goblin language, which is goblinoids, goblins and hobgoblins and bugbears and whatever else is related to them, right? So, and as of 3rd, to my knowledge, you don't have alignment languages, right? They scrubbed alignment languages, and the closest analog is they have these exotic languages at the bottom of abyssal, celestial, and infernal, right? Which is basically 3 parts of the outer planes, right? There's the good, the lawful evil, the chaotic evil. Sort of your analogs, and I believe clerics get to pick one of those languages for free. So greatly collapsed, right? Player characters aren't going to start off with 10 languages like they used to, but in 5th you get maybe 2 or 3, and in 6th everybody's going to get 3. So I feel like very quickly you're going to cover all the bases, right? If you have about 20 languages in the world and you have 5 players and they all have 3 languages each, that's possibly 15-ish languages, and you're pretty quickly just going to cover all the bases, as opposed to, like you were saying, Paul, in 1st edition where you had just an indefinite number of languages and you never had any hope of covering all of them. I wonder what's better.
Don't know, honestly, right? Like because you kind of want both moments, right? You want those moments in the game where no one understands the language, And you want those moments in the game where one person understands the language, and that's interesting because that person's in the limelight now. Yeah, I don't know that there's a right answer to this.
What? There should be one.
Before we run out of time, I also want to bring up, somewhat related, is the question of literacy, and that that can almost be considered yet another language, or at least creates similar role play experiences. And my main the main point where I've come across that is playing Warhammer. Most of the Warhammer Fantasy role play games assume at the baseline illiteracy. And, if you play the right type of character, maybe you get to be literate, which is interesting, right? It's fun. Different characters going to get pushed in the limelight. Oh, we found a book. Give it to the guy who can read. But the funny thing is, it also is a hindrance to gameplay, I found. If you're going to sit down and play Warhammer and play, say, the classic Enemy Within campaign, guess what? A huge quantity of the handouts are things like letters and notes and written material, because that's the kind of thing we can hand out as a form of gameplay. And then you're in bad shape if you accidentally ended up with a group of characters of which none are literate.
Good point.
Good point. I guess this group is not the group to solve this mystery when they can't read any of the letters.
Let me pull up a good recollection from Disparal BB, actually, because he nicely summarizes how D&D has handled that. Is in second edition, literacy was a non-weapon proficiency, so you could have skills specifically in literacy. In third edition, they gave it to everybody except the barbarian class. So it said in third edition, it says if you know a language, you know how to read and write it. Unless you're a barbarian, then you got to pay skill points for it, and it hasn't been addressed since.
Interesting.
So it's an interesting. And of course we can contrast this with Warhammer, which at least initially sounds kind of interesting to me, actually. But yeah, this difference between verbal. Are we talking verbal language? Are we talking written language? And then you can dig into right in original D&D. It's a little bit bipolar, because in one place it says you get more languages from your intelligence. And then there might be magic spells that allow you to speak languages freely. Now, there aren't any spells in original D&D that allow you to speak languages whatsoever. What there is there's a spell that allows you to read, right? There's the first level read languages spell that allows you to read stuff, but not speak it, and also not write it. And it wasn't until a later edition that they added the tongue spell to actually let you talk to people. So that distinction is clearly, and again, focus on the written word and how important writing is going to be is built right into the first level spells in original D&D.
Yeah, I wonder if that's not, though. I feel like the written word becomes more important because it is a role-playing game, right? That because we're playing a role-playing game where you are exploring ancient forgotten locations, like sort of implicit in the setting and implicit in the gameplay, writing becomes more important. Is my theory. I don't know.
I think it certainly ties into all the action you see in Tolkien, right? You get secret words and messages and things like that. So I certainly feel that ties into that kind of action that we want to experience ourselves. So it makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? As I think about Tolkien, like besides obviously all the background of how much of a linguist Tolkien was, and the invention of all these languages, but that he did in fact write it into the plot, right? That there's a key moment of language where Gandalf is trying to open the door, and you have that sort of pun of speak friend and enter, and so one of the Frodo figures it out, and anyway, what am I getting at? There's a social interaction around language there, right? Like it's not just linguistics in terms of translation or able to talk, but there's a social interaction between two characters of I don't know this language, but I figured out the riddle. What is the word for friend, right?
Yeah.
You want those moments. I guess that's what
role-playing is about.
Right? That's what role playing is about, right? Yeah, get those interesting little social moments out, and that's I feel like you can't force those moments. You can't make them happen, but you can set them up, and you can set them up by having rules around languages and who knows what, and tuning that such that those moments are able to happen.
Good thoughts. Let me bring it back before we run out of time. Let me bring it back to alignment languages, and that might be a whole hour-long conversation on its own. But I've got to bring this out. In fact, there's a point here that John Miller explained in the chat, like about 20 minutes back, that I've got to touch on. So, alignment languages feel prickly to me. On the one hand, if you're talking like black speech of a faction, that's a pretty good defense of it. If you're talking about a family of languages, like with Tolkien's, tripartite structure, that can kind of sort of make sense. Now, when you get to I think it makes more sense with 3 alignments than it does with 9. Once you have 9 alignments and you have lawful good language versus neutral good language, that starts to become harder for me to swallow personally. There's exactly this many factions. When you move to first edition, there's a block of text in DMG where Gygax really tries really hard to dial it back, and he puts a whole lot of narrative limitations on it. He says, well, you got I know I told you that everybody with the alignment has this alignment language, but it's very limited. You can only talk about things related to the ethical issue, right? You can only talk about the ethical issues about the language. It's only got a couple dozen words. It's largely symbols and sign language. It's incredibly restricted. Nobody's ever going to use it in public. It's considered socially unacceptable to possibly speak what your alignment is in public. So nobody would ever do it in public. You can't say hello. Do you speak chaotic good? And only in the greatest of extremities would you possibly greet someone in alignment language. And I'm like, it's D&D. You're always in the greatest of extremity. You're always about to die all the time. So that's no restriction whatsoever. And then he tries to put all these kinds of buffers. And then he says, not every monster with the alignment is going to have the alignment language now. So blink dogs are lawful good, but they're not culture related to other lawful good things, so they don't know the lawful good alignment. And I'm like, well, now I don't know how to rule on this. Yeah. And then finally he says, if you change alignment, you lose the alignment language. And that's probably like the canonical thing that I just cannot make coherent for myself, is I can't see someone knowing a language and then changing their ethical outlook and then losing the language. And I cannot make sense of that at all. So the truth is, nowadays I largely hand wave the issue of alignment languages in my game. If you're going to do that, you've got to at least bring some kind of interpretation to it. It's got to be like a factional language, or I don't know, maybe it's for the leaders of the armies to coordinate, like, I don't know, like NATO or something like that, in the black speech. So you've at least got to have some kind of interpretation to make that coherent, because I think in the book I'm at a loss for how it's presented in first edition. I cannot make sense of it.
I could see give me a second here to follow this train of thought, which is maybe a little odd. I could see an argument for the alignment languages maybe are not a spoken language, but they're rather representative of language families, right? So just like whatever I'm not a linguist, I'm not going to use the right words here, but like parent families of things like French and Spanish, they're related. So maybe goblins and orcs, maybe you could say that the alignment language just symbolizes that their languages are based on the same root language. So a goblin can speak goblin to an orc and be partially understood.
That's a pretty good solution, because when I was talking to, my partner Isabel, who's the number one multilingual person that I know, unprompted, she said that ought to be part of the simulation. If you're going to simulate languages in a game, that you ought to have some way of simulating the fact that certain families of language are easier to pick up for people than others. And, as a French speaker, pretty darn easy to pick up Italian or Spanish, but trying to learn Chinese, immensely hard. So actually, I like that a lot because it kind of kills two birds with one stone. It sort of makes alignment languages coherent, plus it does introduce this family language representation that we kind of like.
It has one major problem. It has one major problem, I think, which is because languages in D&D are tied to race, it makes that assumption that so too is alignment, right? Okay. And as we know, that's a little problematic, right? So I almost would rather somebody just draw a tree, and maybe they already have, and maybe that's exactly what we're looking at here in our 3rd edition through 6th edition of like, there are these language families and these languages fall under them, and there you go. And that's why, Goblinoid is Goblinoid, and Bugbears and Goblins and Orcs all speak a version of it. They can more or less communicate with each other.
Yeah, that's a nice addition. I've done that for my game. I know other people have done that for their games. I think that's a nice addition. The one other thing I want to do on alignment languages is look at how our best knowledge about exactly how Gary ran it in his game. If you can pull up the image, Paul, with the blue icon, which we knew this was going to happen. So this is from, what we're going to see here is from the original D&D 74 forums. And the primary the innermost plus the primary post is from Mike Mornard, posting as Dronin of Samaria. And Mike was one of the original players who played with both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. I think he's the only person that played with both, actually. So his recollection was, for player characters in original D&D with Gary, the vast majority of us were neutral, and you had to do something pretty egregious to change alignment. As someone stated above, it was a game artifact of enabling to have sides in your war game. So more or less what Mike is arguing there is that alignment was more or less just hand-waved in Gary's games. They didn't talk about it very much. It wasn't a very big issue. Basically, everybody was neutral all the time. And then someone, Oak Spalding here, asks for clarification, like why was everybody neutral? And what Mike responds with at the bottom is he says, because as neutral, you were only one step away from either law or chaos. Again, three alignments here. And by learning both of those alignment languages, you had at least a chance of being able to communicate with any sentient creature. This was especially important in terms of wandering monsters. So according to Mike, everybody in Gary's games picked neutral and then learned the lawful and chaotic languages as extra languages from their intelligence. Technically, that's allowed because the book says you're opposed to diametrically opposite alignments. So I guess that's technically allowed. And by knowing those three languages, now you can talk to anything that talks. And I think I hate that.
Yeah.
Am I crazy? Yeah. I think I hate that because all this interesting conversation that we've been having about languages and the role play you get from talking through them and the different players getting to have the spotlight for a while, that just gets whooped right off your gaming table. And I'm like, why do we have a language rule then? Why do we have lists of languages and rules for languages and alignment bonuses and all that kind of stuff if you're just going to say, the party can talk to everybody through the alignment languages? I kind of don't like that. Am I nuts?
Yeah, that's... No.
Am I having a stroke over that?
I mean, unfortunately, what we're missing here, and what I would love to see, is Gary's reaction to that. Because I feel like, as DM, I could see a player coming up with that and me going, oh, God, give me a break. Like, really?
I can see that. And, Griff Morgan is in the chat right now reminding us that, to his recollection, Mornard mostly played with Barker in I believe, the Blackmore game. He's for what it's worth, Mike was, and I've talked to him in person at least once, very generous guy. Mike has been very dogmatic about his experiences playing with Gary and Dave. Occasionally, not everybody agrees with those. So there's a bit of a Rashomon effect here. That's Mike's recollection from 50 years ago. Maybe Gary would have said something different.
Yeah.
But I don't let there's so much interesting play from languages that I certainly wouldn't want to just wipe it off the table and say everybody can talk to everybody. That seems like a huge loss to me.
Interesting. Well, I think I agree with that. Dan, we are out of time here. We have run the clock. Any final thoughts on languages?
I don't mind the classic languages rule. I actually like having lots and lots of languages, and kind of like the real world, and players possibly having a bunch on their sheet. I like this surprise from what player has to take the spotlight in the negotiations. I've got a lot of interesting play out of that. I'm not super fond of alignment languages. You've got to at least massage that in your game, if not just delete that. And they've done that in 3rd edition. And you know what? For me, I don't mind having the languages binary. I don't mind having binary resources for spells or feats or languages, and having to track points for those things and talk about them in your game. Like, I don't really want players to go, well, I've got 15 points in Orcish, but you have 23 points in Orcish. Right? I would rather have the conversation be, I know Orcish and you don't. Yeah. It seems like a more interesting narrative flow to me. So I actually don't mind the original rule. I kind of like it. I'm happy to stick with it, frankly.
I almost want like a much larger grain. I wouldn't mind variations of how well you know a language, but I want it very big grain. I want, like, you speak it poorly, you speak it well, you can read and write it. Like, those are probably and I'm not even sure that's a linear progression, right? Like, that's like do I speak it poorly or well? Can I read and write or not? It's like probably enough. I want that kind of 2x2 grid of options.
I don't mind that. I think in my notes I actually said if you had to give grades to that, I don't want to go more than 6 at most, right? If you say I've got a language and it's fair, poor, or good, I could live with that. And if you gave me a 6-point scale, I could live with that. But I don't want 20 points. I don't want 20-point scale, and I don't want a percentage scale either. I can't handle that.
Well, viewers, if you have opinions on languages, how many there should be, whether it should be binary or not, how to use it in your role-playing game, please leave us comments here in the YouTube video. We would love to hear your thoughts, and maybe we will speak some more, hopefully in English, about the topic.
Yeah, and if there's a particular thread here that you'd like to see another episode about, feel free to tell us in the comments. If you want a whole hour on alignment languages, or what about the magic, right? The magic that allows you to talk. We didn't talk too much about that today, so maybe those are all episodes we could do coming up. And of course, remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us and Wandering DMs on places like YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and GitHub and TikTok. There's a lot of words there. By the handle Wandering DM. So look for us on those sites and you'll get updates on upcoming shows.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can find those podcasts on our website at wanderingdms.com. Also through various podcasters such as iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcast. If you are listening to this podcast right now at one of those third-party carriers, please take a moment to rate and review us on that site. That helps other users of that site find our show, and we really appreciate it.
We really do. And of course, huge thanks to our patrons who support the show. We've gotten a whole bunch of new patrons recently, actually, which is great. And thank you for joining. If you're in a position where you'd like to join our existing patrons, please go to patreon.com/wanderingdms. And you'll see we've got 3 different tiers there. You'll get discounts on merch, monthly behind-the-scenes stuff we try to do, trying to get out dungeon design adventures that we've done previously, and of course, access to a private Discord server. We're going to be there in about 10 minutes for our after chat live video to continue the conversation about languages as we do every week. One of the favorite things we do every week. Paul, will you be joining us from Montreal, or do you need to?
I will for a little bit at least. I might need to wander off a little early, but I will be there. Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully not into a forbidden place.
It's forbidden.
Look for our upcoming shows, right? I'll be back Thursday late night Eastern time for more of me playing AD&D Pool of Radiance. I'm currently on a 2-week streak with no TPKs. I'm happy to I'm happy to report that. So I'm going to go for the 3-peat this week. Can I do it?
Good luck.
Maybe so. Yeah, thank you. Going to be Thieves and Temple of Bane coming up, I think. But of course, don't forget that we are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So we hope you'll join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.